Before that, I welcome Professor Tyagu to the dais. Professor Tyagu sir has gracefully accepted to chair the meeting. Uh, Sir, please. Uh, I'll hand it over to Professor Tyagu to take over the proceedings of the session. Thank you.
Good evening, sir. Hello. Yeah, welcome everyone. It's glad to meet Professor Jayaraman after 8 years or so. Sir, you might remember me from IG. Yeah, so it's great. It's great to have you here. And I think today he'll be presenting about, on a topic, but his areas of research include climate change, climate policy, energy issues, global mitigation and carbon budgets, and vulnerability and adaptation, sustainability studies with special emphasis on equity, science and technology policy in advanced studies and technology sectors, including nuclear policy, and select themes from philosophy of science and history of science and innovation policies and issues. Professor Jayaraman, I know him personally through because of this organization called as Tamil Nadu Science Forum. So it is one of the Science Popularization Institute, a voluntary organization, and I think he's been very active in popularizing science. He was also an advisory member when I started working on pesticide use in Vidarbha. So I thought you were coming here, Professor, and I was very happy about it. But virtually is
Well,
also good. And I think many of the aspects about science and science popularization I learned from Tamil Nadu Science Forum. I think Kerala has a KSSP, Pondicherry has a Pondicherry Science Forum. They do a tremendous job of making science accessible to others and also getting all the intricate points about what science means to society. As when it comes to climate studies, we always knew Professor Jayaraman to be the person. So we're glad to hear you. Welcome, sir. And you can take about 45 minutes. Is that
yes, yes.
around 45 minutes, and then we can have questions. And I think we'll have the questions towards the end because it is virtual, so that's better. Huh? And those who are online, if you have any questions, you can type it in the chat window. As and when you have the questions, we'll pick it up later after the questions on the floor here. Sir, it's up. You can. The floor is yours, sir. Yeah.
Yes. So let me first share the PowerPoint. Start. Okay. So thank you, Dr. Tiago and Abhinav, for your kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to speak on this subject, especially to an audience of people who specialize in the issue of development. And after all, it is the Center of Development Studies with long and very distinguished tradition. I've had the pleasure of knowing many of the teachers and senior people of this institution. So I continue to, uh, follow some of its work at least. So this is a particularly good opportunity. Let me go straight to the subject at hand. And what I am going to talk about, perhaps I hope it will not disappoint you, but what I thought I would do is to take the title that I got from Abhinav. So if you don't like the title, that's Abhinav's fault. So I would take the title seriously and work to provide some understanding of what exactly the title intends to convey. I am, of course, very much aware that we are having this discussion in the very painful aftermath of the tragic events in Wayanad. I was associated with the Kerala State Planning Board as member with particular responsibility for environment and climate change in the period 20 in the previous ministry of the government, and I was a member when the 2018 and 2019 floods happened. And particularly in 2019, it was accompanied also by severe landslides. So I think in some ways, I have also witnessed some of these challenges as someone who was working within government at this stage. And therefore, I can appreciate the extent of the trauma and shock that such the events of this year represent. Nevertheless, what I will do is I will not attempt to address the issue of Wayanad directly. I will speak to the issue of climate change and development. I will hopefully have a little time to speak about the issues that are relevant to Wayanad. So I would be grateful if Dr. Tiago would give me a heads up at, say, half an hour. So about, say, 25 minutes from now, please give me a heads up. You can interrupt and tell me 40, half an hour is up. And then I will switch to Wayanad immediately, or I will try to do so.
Okay.
Thank you. So this is the framework for the talk. So let me proceed immediately to the subject at hand. So I think when you take the term development, this is not something that I need to remind the students of development, that it is conceptually something of a contested term in terms of what it is understood academically, what it means to those who consider themselves in need of further development. And there is much about it that remains unsettled and debated. And this is not something which is purely an academic artifact. And I think this reflects the challenges of the real world, a real world which I may add, perhaps I should have it in the PPT, a real world that is tremendously unequal, both within and between countries. And so development obviously means different things. The different nations have had different trajectories of growth and development. And so these processes and achievements in different countries and regions mean different things. So the contestation over the term development is a reflection of the facts of the real world, I think, and this is something which we should keep in mind. This does not mean, of course, that the world has not learned anything over the last 150 or 250 years, depending on how you put it. So I think at the United Nations, which is truly, for all its faults, and these are many in nature, for all its faults, however, the UN remains the preeminent forum where countries, societies meet to converse and discuss with each other. So I think at the United Nations, if there is some kind of common understanding, this is valuable. So, and I have just cited here from the UN resolution, which is basically the provision of the material basis of well-being. So that is roughly what development is. And of course, everybody agrees that you cannot simply say we are developed, quote unquote. There is something of a continuing process. It does include the idea of sustained economic growth for economic and social development and environmental protection. It is generally accepted that it must be broadly based to benefit all. And certainly, given the realities of the world, it must include the eradication of poverty, hunger, and illiteracy, the provision of shelter, secure employment, etc. And this, of course, not limited to this, but also answering the needs and aspirations of societies. And this is not something which you can ignore. Unfortunately, the devil, of course, is in the details, and there is a constant attempt which goes back almost to the beginning of the industrial era itself, of constantly rewriting this to a minimalist prescription of material needs. So the old wine of the development as something problematic, that material basis of well-being is something which simply promotes greed, or all kinds of moralistic or other such attitudes, or couched in language which is anti-technology, etc. This old wine, of course, keeps reappearing in new bottles, and we will see evidence of this shortly. Then I think I must also very quickly point to the distinction between climate change and other environmental concerns. And I think this is very important to underline. What distinguishes climate change? I think climate change, one, has an irreducibly global character. And this is absolutely important. So local action to reduce GHG emissions has little local benefit. So, for instance, if we are at a warming as we are today of 1.1 degrees centigrade, then the contribution that India has made to this warming is, I'm not 100% sure of the numbers. This is there in the literature, we can look it up. And this is something like less than 0.2 degrees. So our contribution is small. So, you might be enthusiastic about reducing emissions in India. Then, of course, that does not mean that the impact of climate change through various ways will be any less for you. So this is very important. The second thing is, of course, this does not mean that because everybody's contribution is a drop in the ocean, there is no ocean at all. So you also have the importance of cumulative and aggregating accounting of emissions is important, aggregated spatially, both globally and at the national level, and over time, what is referred to as historical responsibility for cumulative emission. So this is very important. The finiteness of the resource issue that underlies it is also very important. This is very different from other environmental concerns. So, for instance, if you have water, we are not really in danger of exhausting water, though we could exhaust perhaps in an extreme scenario fresh water. So if we take action, then we can ensure that we continue to have forests. Forests are a renewable resource. But what is different about the issue of climate change is that we need carbon for development. All we know about improving material well-being depends on the use of fossil fuels. Yet it is this very use of fossil fuels that threatens us. So this contradiction, which is really a contradiction in the classic sense of the term, this contradiction is central to the issue. And I will speak briefly about why the global carbon budget is relevant here. On the other hand, environmental concerns deal with largely renewable resources. Of course, if you cut down a forest within a year, then you're not going to have forest for a very long time. And if you further keep interfering, then of course forests are finite and they disappear. But in principle, however, if you take care, forests can be regenerated. So there is a real difference between carbon and forest, for instance, in that sense. In environmental concerns, and I think there is a very important role for the cultural, the aesthetic, other normative concerns. For instance, do we care for animals and so on and so forth? Whereas that's not quite the case with climate change. Of course, climate change impacts do affect the all living things, etc. in that sense, but it's not like a direct sort of issue that we have with environment. So, of course, environment is often easily framed in terms of rights and justice. The notion of climate rights and justice, however, takes from environmental rights and justice. So here the distinctions, there are important distinctions, but these are not always clear to people. In environment, biodiversity is a new concern, and I think a very important source of confusion arises in the intersection, in thinking about the intersection of biodiversity and climate. So to move on, so what about climate change and development? So, as you are all aware, as I have already pointed out, we profoundly depend on fossil fuels for electricity production, for energy systems in general. There are also some direct uses of fossil fuels. And I think it is true to say that though we have not built an equitable world, but fossil fuels have enabled a world where the overcoming of material scarcity is possible. So I think this is very important. It cannot be ignored. The Industrial Revolution, and together with it, many dimensions of modernity, though we will not reduce one to the other. Industrial revolution is powered by fossil fuel use, and development as such, if we to get back to the term, critically needs energy. This was widely recognized in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, and subsequently the catching up with regard to industrialization. The first catching up was in the Russia in the era of the Soviet Union, and famously they said Soviet power is, socialism, they said, is Soviet power plus electricity. So, the critical need for energy was early recognized, and this has always been the case. We have rediscovered it again. So, energy is a central issue when we talk about climate change and development. So we live in a world marked by severe global inequalities in energy access. I personally think that inter-country inequalities dominate the intra-country inequalities, notwithstanding some of the followers of Mr. Piketty. But I really think that inter-country inequalities dominate. The severity of this disparity, if you want to understand, is that there are countries in Africa where the per capita consumption of electricity is less than the annual consumption of electricity by a refrigerator in the United States. So this is the scale of lack of energy. So what is the challenge? The challenge is that developed countries need to lead with drastically reducing their huge dependence on fossil fuels, whereas developing countries need to continue to increase energy access while increasingly trying to draw it from renewable resources sources. Now, why is that essential? And this is because of the story of what is the global carbon budget. One of the most important developments of climate science for climate policy in the last 15 years has been the establishing of what is called the global carbon budget. And this tells us that the probability of limiting temperature increase to a definite level, which we need in order to control global warming, depends on the cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide. So primarily, there are other GHG gases, but that is a technical detail we can leave for later. So it is historical emissions plus future emissions. And of course, this probability is for the fact that you have different scenarios. So you cannot, given the uncertainties of climate science, sticking to a particular temperature limit is something you estimate up to uncertainties. So for different probabilities of limiting temperature to global temperature increase above pre-industrial levels. These are not local temperatures. Okay. So what has happened to this carbon budget? So if you consider that we want to limit our increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade, unfortunately, we find that 83% of this carbon budget has been consumed. Which means what? Which means that your ability to use fossil fuels for even short-term or medium-term development begins to be constrained. And this is made worse by the fact that there are severe inequalities in the both historical and the present emissions of fossil fuels across countries. So for 2 degrees centigrade, the situation is no better. 66% is consumed. We have a little more headroom here. So who has consumed it? Okay, like the bear said to Goldilocks, who ate my porridge? So who consumed my carbon? So, and one is compute. I think my connection was interrupted. When was it interrupted? Hello, can you hear me?
Sir, yeah, we can hear you. I think we lost you when you had come with the table with uh, with two
Ah,
rows and
okay,
some columns.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
Ah,
Ah,
yeah, this
good.
one. Yeah. When you
Yeah,
started. Yeah.
yeah, okay.
Okay.
I think
Right.
it is not
Yes.
too far back.
Yeah.
So you will see that, in fact, if you look at the 2018 period, then you will find that if you discount China, which is in this 54% that you see below, then the share of the rest of the world is still that 29%. Okay. Now, the share of the global population, however, so you need to have some scale, no? What is the meaning of how much you emit? Am I emitting more or less? And the only reasonable scale, we can discuss it further if people are interested, is basically share in the global population. So you see, 18% of the global population has consumed a vastly disproportionate share of the global carbon budget, which is the allowed cumulative emissions, whereas the rest of the world has consumed very little. You can break this down and you will see, for instance, people say China has consumed a great deal. This is somewhat outdated figures. My apologies. I took it quickly from an old PowerPoint, but the picture is not very dramatically different if you have more recent numbers. And India's share is, of course, extremely small, less than 4%. In fact, all of South Asia, which is 25% of the global population, has contributed only 4%. So India is even less. This is not really particularly encomium to us for recognizing our sustainability. It is actually a sign of extreme energy poverty and general lack of development in our. Is there an issue? Just 1 second. We are checking. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sir, we can hear you. There is no. We are able to hear you fine. Yeah.
Very good, because I'm not on my foundation's. Uh, okay, sorry, just give me a second. I
Yeah.
need to recheck my. Just to refix my setting. Just a minute. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you. Are you sharing anything, sir? The slides we are not seeing now. The slides
Okay,
we are not seeing. Sir.
I'll go back to it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So you can, so India's low contribution to cumulative emissions is not so much uh, certificate of sustainability as a symbol of our continuing development deficits. So, this goes back to Castro's idea of ecological debt, which he articulated in the United Nations even prior to the climate convention. And in fact, you can monetize this sort of roughly by attaching a dollar value per ton, and you can talk of carbon debts and carbon credits, okay? And you will see the scale at even a moderate price of carbon, the scale of the debt which is owed to the developing world by the global north. So the other very important point that follows from this is cumulative emissions are important. Then aiming for net zero by the end of 2050 or 2045, they think they are doing us a big favor, is not very relevant. So even if you take only the remaining carbon budget, meaning from what is allowed to be emitted from 1990 or 2020, 2018 onwards, in this case for our figures here, you see that a country like USA must be reach zero emissions by 2025. Canada by 2025, Germany by 2030, UK perhaps a little later, but so the extent to even China is severely constrained because of what has happened earlier. So I think one of the persistent problems globally is that the uh, the rich countries have persistently refused to talk about this carbon budget, and hence so the continued shrinking of development space, okay, is becomes important. So what I would like to very briefly point out is that we need a new paradigm compared to what is usually discussed in the global discourse. And I would just like to point out some work that we have been doing uh, with work that I have participated in with my colleague Tejal Kanitkar from NIAS and her student Ms. Ankita Ranjan. And so one of the things is that everybody wants to begin, especially from the global north, including academics, unfortunately, uncritically repeated in India as well. Everybody wants to begin from reducing emissions. So I think if we were talking about development, then what you need is to begin from a question of the presence of energy inequity in the world and how to move towards adequate energy, because it is perhaps the most critical part of the material foundation of development, and develop scenarios for energy equity, keeping in mind the constraints of the carbon budget, because we do not want to exceed the temperature limits beyond the point where life becomes very difficult on Earth. And based on that, we need to look at how to deal with energy. Energy in relation to growth and energy in relation to emissions. Unfortunately, much of the literature is dominated by where does least cost emissions reduction take place in the world and how can it be done. And using the standard machinery of neoclassical economics, it ends up in terribly inequitable scenarios. So I'll just come to that very briefly in a minute. So we have been looking at looking at a different classification of the world. This is not exactly the World Bank levels of development, the income level classification is based on energy. So you see, this shows you immediately what is the, actually this should be 13 variables here. So you look at the stark difference in per capita energy use and corresponding per capita CO2 emissions. So you look at the high development, you look at where the medium development countries are located, and you look at this enormous gap. And already between the first and the second, the gap is so significant. So the question really is, how much energy do we need? And here, of course, there is, as I had told you earlier, the old wine comes back in new bottles. I must draw your attention particularly to this second entry here, Rao et al. 2019. This was cited extensively in the IPCC Working Group 3 report, which says, which claims that an energy threshold of 10 to 11 gigajoules per capita per year is more than sufficient, even though the level of the others is significantly higher. So this is in fact for countries like India even going backward. So this, finds prominent attempt. This, of course, I must assure you, despite the name, is not a paper from India. It's a paper from the United States. So whereas in our own work, by looking at the broad correlations between various development indicators and at what level of energy use do countries reach certain development thresholds, we can come to a more reasonable figure of 94 gigajoules per capita per year. So then, of course, it's a matter of designing scenarios with both climate equity so that you get a fair share of the remaining carbon budget, and also ensuring that you have some kind of energy equity. So I will not go into the technical details. We will not have the time. But just to point out, number one, that even with an emphasis on equity, low carbon development requires unprecedented reduction in the energy intensity of GDP as well as emissions intensity of energy, which is the ratios that you see in the formula. So we have looked at certain scenarios. So with energy equity, so we are looking at a scenario where per capita GDP also shows some convergence. The scenarios considered in the literature by and large, so reflected in the IPCC, also retain very significant divergences in per capita GDP between different categories of countries. So here is, if you want energy GDP coupling, the y-axis shows the annual reduction in energy intensity of GDP. So G1 is the developed countries, the first category of the highest category of development. So if you have current trends which are inequitous, so energy inequity would only their effort would be much less. Whereas if you think of energy equity, the reduction they need to have is significantly higher. This is the current observed value. So this is for G2. These countries, of course, category, their burden is still significant. Uh, China would be in this category, whereas India would be in G3. So, for instance, if you look at energy equity or the lack of equity, which is current inequity continues with minor increases for G3 and G4, which is basically what the IPCC is telling us, then you see that the burden on countries like India is significantly higher. And so, there's the enthusiasm which is shown for mitigation in the Indian context, very often is driven by the discourse from the global north, and simple issues of what is equitable and or not equitable is ignored. Sometimes unsurprising because they are ignored even in the domestic context. So this is our current rate of decline. And so this is, of course, for the countries which are in the lowest category. So in all these, in both the energy equity and inequity scenarios, the gray bar shows the global effort required. So I think it matters very much whether even if you have a global scale of reduction, how it is distributed between countries. Now, here is the story with regard to emissions. So you have both energy equity and climate equity, and climate equity being getting a fair share of the remaining carbon budget. And so you see that if you have both energy and climate equity, then the scale of reduction which is required in emissions intensity of energy is minus 8% per annum. Okay. Whereas their current effort, which you can see here, observed values, is minus 1.3%. Well, of course, it is true that the others are also not able to measure up, but clearly, if the countries which have the most significant resources and the most significant wealth are not able to do it, and also access to technology, it's obviously going to be much harder for the others. So you see in all of this, the gray bar indicates the global effort. So there are very important differences in the distribution of the global effort, which arises when you consider equity issues. So unfortunately, the IPCC, and I won't go into this in any detail, has provided a set of results, a summary of the results in the literature. The literature is dominated by work from the global north, so the output is unsurprisingly inequitable. So what you find is that in all these cases, the solution to the climate crisis is sought in restricting both growth and energy consumption in the global south. So basically, if you have already reached a certain level, well and good. But if you have not reached that level, then you are going to be stuck where you are for the next foreseeable future. And this is really what they recommend. Unfortunately, in the name of best available science, this is propagated to the negotiations and uncritically echoed by all kinds of actors who should know better on the Indian scene. So you look at South Asia, yes?
Sir, we're about 30 minutes into the talk, sir.
Yes,
35 minutes. You told me to nudge you.
Yeah.
Okay, sir.
Yes.
Fine,
Yeah.
sir.
Thank you. So you see, in all these four categories, this is 1.5, these two are 1.5 warming scenarios, C3 and C4 are 2-degree warming scenarios. The labels come from the IPCC Working Group 3 report. Just look at the last two, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and look at the quantum of inequality in per capita energy consumption which is projected by the literature, and this literature comes from the global north overwhelmingly, and this is what is passed on as science, objective science in the negotiations. So let me quickly turn in the next available time, in the remaining time, to both talking about adaptation, which will provide us a bridge to talking more specifically about more in the question answer than otherwise. So, with regard to adaptation, I think the challenge in a certain sense is more sharper than with mitigation. I personally think that there is no need to redefine the term development, though there is academic literature that talks of, a new compact with nature and, new relationship to nature. Even political leaders in China, they talk of ecological civilization. In India, the government, through Prime Minister Modi, talks of lifestyle for environment, whatever. But personally, I think that when you're talking of adaptation, redefining what we mean by development is not necessary in the short to medium term, meaning up to 2050 at least. So, how do we think of the impact of climate change on development, especially the realization of human and social development goals? Do we think of a new trajectory of development, or is it better to think of climate change as an additional constraint? Neither of these two options seem satisfactory. And I think of course, if you think of the increasing level of warming, then perhaps the case for a new trajectory appears to be a little more, a little stronger. But I really think that what we need, we are not yet in a position, I think, to really decide, because there are three criteria which we have not sufficiently paid attention to. And I'll be very clear, I think we are not paying attention as we should to this. One is, whenever we think of a relevant sector, whether you think of water, whether you're thinking of migration, whether you're thinking of health, whether you are thinking of gender equality, whatever, what is the relative importance? Not gender equality, perhaps I overstated the case. We come back to that in discussion if you want. The relative importance of climatic and non-climatic factors is an issue which is something to decide. So why do we not get water in the cities for a major part of the population on a regular basis? And these are phenomena which clearly predate the intensification of climate change and global warming. So I think there is a whole discourse from the north which tries to say everything is climate. There are uncritical converts to this discourse, unfortunately, which seems to include members of the higher judiciary as well. So the balance of climatic and non-climatic factors, that's number one. The second is, what is the role of climatic factors in attaining globally established levels? Meaning, if we want to diminish our development deficits, we want to erase our development deficits, What is the role of climatic factors in attaining this? And because there is, of course, likely to be increasing climatic impacts along this pathway, whatever that pathway is. And for long-term infrastructure, factoring in future development pathways. Unfortunately, in all three of them, there are huge knowledge gaps when it comes to decision making. We can learn quite a bit from current climate variability because, after all, its intensification is one of the features of the future with climate change. But this considerable source of learning is not utilized properly because this is directly confused with climate change itself and labeled adaptation. And this, of course, the consequence of this is this distracts attention seriously from an adequate knowledge agenda for filling these knowledge gaps that I have already mentioned. In fact, going back when we are talking about the relative importance of climatic and non-climatic factors, there is a really regrettable trend in the literature, especially including the IPCC, I must say, where you cherry pick literature what talks about climatic factors, like say climate and security, climate and conflict. Now, of course, there is a lot of literature which points out that this geographical determinism is not really what determines social phenomena, but this literature is ignored because they don't consider climate. And so this is a very unbalanced way of thinking about these issues. Very poor attention to detection and attribution. How much is attributed to climate change? This requires very significant scientific resources. And I am sorry to say that we have not invested enough in this country. And also attention to local factors. So, I must say that a very good example of this is recently we had a major study from a well-known think tank. I will refrain from naming it, and which said that sea level rise is going to be this in all these cities along the Indian coastline. They do what is called the bathtub method, which is that you just assume that it is like a bathtub, so water will fill up and everything up to a certain level will be affected. But this is really not correct. There are environmental, geophysical, social factors which have to be accounted for. There can be upwelling, uplift of the coastal land. There could be subsidence. There could be accretion. There could be erosion. There are many factors. The government, actually, the Ministry of Earth Sciences is making greater efforts, but unfortunately, this is not reflected at all in this report. And the report has obtained considerable traction in the media. So I think we need greater clarity. I think target setting is not easy in unlike mitigation in adaptation. And I think for India, the adaptation challenge is unambiguously more important than mitigation. And there is, of course, a confusion between biodiversity and other environmental challenges and adaptation. For most prominent among these is that talking about conservation. Conservation is the first recourse when you are talking about biodiversity conservation, but conservation is not necessarily the best option when you are talking about adaptation. And of course, then the idea is that you must do conservation plus, that you must expand your scope of conservation. And that obviously creates even more issues. So I think these are some of the issues. Now, very briefly, if I may, in 5 minutes, I think especially the points that I have made about adaptation are particularly are of some relevance to the issues we are concerned with in Wayanad. Now, for instance, before we jump to there is a last slide which I will pass. We can keep for the discussion. So I think the last bullet that I have mentioned, the confusion between biodiversity and other challenges. Nowadays biodiversity is used as a catch-all term, as an umbrella term to cover all aspects of the biosphere and environmental challenges of the biosphere. So this is the first prominent, I think, source of the issue when we are talking about Wayanad. The second prominent issue is, I think, the attention to local factors. And even prior to that, when you are talking about climatic and non-climatic factors, and if you are talking about environmental issues, you can substitute the term environment for climatic, and I think a lot of what I am saying here will still be applicable. So I think what is the balance between environmental and social and economic issues? Okay. And here I must emphasize that environment, like development, of course, but environment, many people or climate we regard it as some quote unquote objective science, but it is a very anthropocentric science, if you wish. There is no environmental question or climate change question on Mars or Venus, both of which have all kinds of atmospheres which are inhospitable to life. You have it here because the term environment is anthropocentric, without which it would be a matter of biology or geology or whatever. So I think the problem, that is a second problem. I think the third problem in the Wayanad context is coping with current climate variability. I think talking about climate change per se does not help in this context, and in fact distracts from what needs to be done. Finally, I must point out that a lot of the solutions, quote unquote, there was one even today in the Indian Express, assumes that you can dictate well-meaning because you are well-meaning or because you are an eminent scientist, that you can dictate to people what their future needs and aspirations are, or that you can limit them, saying that you don't need this, but you will do this, that you could do this, but not that. So I think that aspect of the problem remains our most considerable challenge. And perhaps what we should treat Wayanad as is a learning ground for, in fact, the much larger challenges which are likely to confront us when dealing with climate change as such. So I'll stop here. There is a little more to say, but I think I leave this slide on here. But well, I'm going to take the slide off. I can't leave it on here. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. I think, I think the basic point seems to be about considering inequality first and then looking at adaptation second, if I'm getting it right. So, Yeah, we could have questions from the floor first and then move to online. Mike, maybe we can take 2, 3 questions and then you can respond.
Yes,
Professor. Yeah,
please.
yeah.
Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, sir. I'm Aishwarya. Thank you for the talk. I'm a student at the center. I had two questions. First was that instead of looking at countries as emitters, why should we not look at individual entities as the problem? For example, if you are saying that India has low carbon emissions, it is probably because India has fewer rich people that it has low carbon emissions. If you take into account, like for example, the Ambani wedding which just happened, it had carbon emissions of more than 5,000 tons almost, and the average Indian has an annual carbon emission of just 2 tons. So it's, and again, you look at this data which shows that almost 80% of the world's carbon emissions can be traced back to 58 companies. So, I mean, we don't even need to target countries. We can simply target these organizations if that is what is our goal. That is, reducing emissions and also reducing the benefits from these emissions. If somebody is able to, like, if 58 countries are responsible for 80% of the world's emissions, the money, the profit coming to them should be distributed among the people who are, not able to do emissions to contribute towards whatever. Like that is what I'm trying to say. Same goes for celebrities in the United States. We all know Taylor Swift has been in a lot of controversy over this, that how she's emitting like more than 1,000 times an average American,
Yeah,
etc.
yeah, I got the idea. Get
Yeah.
to.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so this one more question. The second question was like what you were talking about Wayanad, and if I understood you correctly, or uh, or there's like a probable solution that I want to put forward, and I want to hear your views on it. Shouldn't the state, the scientists of the country, shouldn't the idea be to provide the people of the particular place, be it Wayanad, be it Joshimath, be it Uttarakhand, with objective information as to what kind of threats they are living in? Because climate change is a reality, and this is also a reality that some places are more vulnerable than the other. So, shouldn't people be given proper, clear, objective information which would allow them to make informed decisions with regard to how they want to continue their lives, if they want to continue living in a certain place or not? Would that be a probable way of moving forward?
Yes. We'll have few more questions and then Rahul, yeah.
Hello, sir. So I was just Philip had an idea that as India has a carbon as in quota, is it also practical to have as in quota for the Indian states? As an example, so uh, Kerala has about 50% of forest, and and Maharashtra have only 16% of the forest area. However, Maharashtra has a higher GDP. So is it also practical to have a quota among Indian states and they as in can also trade among each other?
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, Professor, maybe we'll take these questions, and there is one online question from the online participant, Shraddha Jain. She's saying, "Thank you, sir. You showed inequality across regions in terms of energy consumption. Are there inequalities in terms of the burden of climate change experienced across region? My question is the context of calamities being expressed across India. Secondly, to what extent we can separate global and local factors?" Shraddha, you want to
Yeah.
add more to this, or is this fine?
No, I think we can.
Yeah, we can add. Okay.
It is clear. We can do
Okay.
with it.
Okay, Professor. Yeah.
Right.
Mm.
So well, let me start with the first question about how you should consider entities and not consider, units, spatial units or units of governance or political units. That's because in nothing in society we consider as purely individual. This is like saying unemployment should be considered by employment by entities, you know. So this idea somehow that carbon emissions are something of an individual responsibility or a responsibility of an entity is, I think, fundamentally problematic. So you have to consider jurisdictions, because you have to have laws, perhaps, you have to have rules, perhaps, you have to have regulations, perhaps. So the political administration, juridical units matter. That is number one. The second point is that this, I'm no fan. I owe nothing to Mr. Ambani one way or the other. But I think that there are many more sins you can lay at his door compared to just his carbon emission. You see, you live under capitalism. If you live under capitalism, you have to have, there will be rich people. So all you want Mr. Ambani to do is to reduce his emissions, or your problem is with capitalism. So you cannot have capitalism and then say the rich should, reduce the emissions. I think that is fundamentally a very problematic position. So I think this, it's this, and then you propose some kind of DBT to solve the problem. No, it is like LPG subsidy. So the rich will not take subsidy, and or their excess consumption will be passed on as what, cash to other countries or to the poor. That's not the point. The point is to have economic and social systems that are sustainable. That's the crux of the problem. And that is not solved by sort of easy fixes that appear to provide distributive justice. So you take money from the rich and give it to the poor. A sort of Robin Hood solution to climate change is not going to work. So I think it is deeper than that. I know that these solutions are very popular among scientists. There are several people who have written papers saying 1.5-degree mitigation scenarios will endanger food security. They establish this. What is the solution? They say, yes, but the rich countries must provide some money, whereby then we can take care of benefits for the poor. So this kind of solutions, I don't think they work. But finally, I must say, as I pointed out earlier, that I think inter-country inequalities are far more important than intra-country inequalities in emissions. I think the work of Chancel on this, I think there are some problems with it. His earlier work had a better, reflected a better understanding. So if you take the top 1%, 10% of emitters, only 1% of that comes from India. You see, India's average is so high, the few individuals in India who may emit more does not matter, because as I said, when we deal with India as a political, social, economic entity. So I think this chasing entities or chasing even individuals, I think is not a fruitful way to think about the problem. I'll come back to the Wayanad question with regard to the third question. What can I be reminded quickly? These from the second speaker, second question.
Any kind of carbon credits among Indian states.
Indian states. Among Indian states, for the
Hmm.
same reason that we should restrict it to the nation state, I think subnational division of the carbon budget in that sense is a very bad idea. So what you will say, Jharkhand has a lot of emissions, so Jharkhand will stop producing steel, and that you will be left with nothing in Kerala by way of steel. So I think we are interdependent as an economy. we should, in distributing the burden of mitigation, I think we should very importantly see what are our relative strengths. So I must confess, even when I was in the planning board and even now when I am out of it, I am very unimpressed by local declarations of net zero. I'm also unimpressed by state level declarations of net zero. I think it's far more fruitful for Kerala as a policy to look at, to examine how to preserve its forest resources, how to enhance its carbon sinks. And I think that's a far more fruitful contribution than aiming for net zero, because it is not even going to be easy to calculate, to establish what that net zero means. I think it's a very good feel-good slogan. So I think in that sense, I appreciate the spirit in which the net zero declarations by states are made, but I do not think that they provide clarity to policy thinking. So distributing the quote unquote burden, I think should be done keeping in mind the strengths and weaknesses of states. In our current political concerns, we must not override our sense of solidarity with the need for development in Bihar and UP. I mean, these are also part of the Indian Union. So I think there should be a sense of cooperation and solidarity in the distribution of the effort required in combating climate change among Indian states. And I think a genuine spirit of cooperative federalism is required to deal with it. So that will be my statement on that. See, with regard to Wayanad, is not simply scientists providing objective evidence. Okay? What is objective evidence? You see, will you take note of economic issues or not? What is your attitude to migrant labor in the hill areas? These are all part of the solution, these issues. And on these, scientists, I am sorry to say, are as equally, are equally susceptible to various influences as any other layperson. They have no special objectivity that enables them to deal with social issues differently. Or take, for instance, the balance between long-term solutions and short-term solutions. So the moment you have, why not, people who are generally environmentalists, biologists, and people working in climate change are all talking about long-term solutions. And unfortunately, I think in Kerala, we have had very interesting, very coherent interventions that talk about engineering issues. And I think the pursuit of such engineering issues, engineering solutions for the short and medium term must not be drowned out. So in 2019, the Kerala State Planning Board had occasion to commission a study which was headed by the head of the KCST, and that I think has pays some attention to engineering measures, and taking this forward, I think, is very important. So I don't think there is a magic wand. You say objective evidence, and now we will act. Environment doesn't work like that, and all the years of our experience, where you have solutions, we are unable to carry them out. Why does that happen? No, the simple answer is governments are corrupt, they lack political will, they are the contractor lobby. No, I think these explanations are a little bit perhaps here and there too, in a superficial way. But fundamentally, there are issues of how to handle the issue of development, the pressures on livelihoods, and the consequent pressures on the environment. So I think we need a more thoughtful and less firing from the hip kind of solutions. And I look forward to, people as who are in the audience, etc., to carry forward that kind of thinking. I mean, it's a opportunity as much as a challenge before you, I think. With regard to the, very quickly, with regard to the inequalities in terms of the burden of climate change, yes, of course. One of the most unfortunate things, I should have shown this, and it is in fact clear in what the IPCC is doing. You will see that I have put where they provide the least energy consumption. South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, the same IPCC says in Working Group 2, summarizing the literature, that these are the regions of maximum impact. So I think it is true that the bulk of the world, for instance, if you are talking about income strata in the population, more than 50% of the world, or should I say just a minute, this is from Working Group 3, something like the bottom 60% of emitters, 60, the bottom 60% of emitters contribute only 15% of global emissions. Okay. And the bulk of this section of the world is largely composed of those who earn less than $3 US dollars on PPP per day. So it is there are vast numbers of the poor, and if you have such low levels of income and development, it is guaranteed that you are vulnerable to climate change. The relative degree may shift, but you are vulnerable to climate change. So yes, it is true, those who have contributed the least are at the receiving end, and those on whom the burden in the discourse of the global north, those on whom the burden is the most are the ones also who will suffer the most from the impact. So I think we need a new paradigm, a new way to think about these issues. And this is the point which my colleagues and I are trying to work on.
Yes, sir. Maybe there is another question, but I just wanted to ask you one question before we go there. I think this series, there have been some discussions on this Kasturi Rangan committee report, Gadgil committee report and all. And there have been debates about approaches it has taken, and again there are pluses and minuses of it. And you mentioned about some KCHC report. In terms of approach, is it in similar lines with the Kasturi Rangan Gadgil? Because in terms of broader approach, they seem to be similar. So you seem to be more favorable towards the KCHC report. Is it somewhat different, or and
No,
what
no,
do we think of, what do we think of these reports? Like, how do we look at the recommendations of this report? There are questions about implementation, but because there has been an orientation in this series towards looking at these reports and how do we approach that. So if you could throw light on that, that will be helpful. Yeah.
Hey there. Okay.
Mhm.
The first point I want to make is that the KCST report was not, you shouldn't compare it with Kasturi Rangan and Gadgil
Gadgil. Yeah.
report.
So what is the difference in approach? We
No,
wanted
no,
to.
it is not a difference in approach. The mandate itself was different. So the mandate was to look at the impact of I do not have it in front of me. You can look it up on the website of the Kerala State Planning Board, but it was very sharply restricted to the impact of the 2018 and 2019 primarily biodiversity. The mandate was not climate change. The mandate was preserving the biodiversity of the Western Ghats. Okay, that was the issue. And in fact, the other part of the mandate, one of the 5 elements or so of the mandate, is actually a query directly about establishing some kind of a Western Ghats authority. Okay? So I think from the beginning, the Gadgil report had a certain thrust, which was bound to bring it to a point where there was going to be an issue. And this had to do with the political pressures and compulsions. Were there social scientists on the panel? Yes. Could the panel composition have better reflected the kind of issues which would come up subsequently? I think so. But I think the key problem with the Gadgil report, mitigated in the Kasturi Rangan report, but not entirely, was that it was an entirely top-down approach. The people and livelihoods were an afterthought. Now, I recognize that the chief author of the report has subsequently visited panchayats, spoken to people, talks about participatory, uh, about people's movements, etc. But unfortunately, the fact remains that his report and the way the authority would be constituted and would function, whatever he indicated, was entirely top-down. So this is simply not going to work. And the Kasturi Rangan report mitigated it by diluting the numbers, by, shall we say, quote unquote, fragmenting the zones which had to be protected, etc. But you see, this does not go to the crux of the problem. What is the crux of the problem? At least I'm no expert on biodiversity, but this much I have learned, that India's unique challenge in biodiversity is to how is it that we are hotspots of biodiversity at the same time that we are such a densely populated state, region, historically. How did this happen? And in fact, if you talk about the Western Ghats and you talk particularly about Kerala, you have such a huge high density of population, and yet we all agree that there is biodiversity to be preserved. So the question is, how did it manage to stay the way it is at least? So I think this requires some new thinking, you know. There is something we have to discover participatory about preserving biodiversity, you know. So I think the Gadgil report or the Kasturi Rangan report, in that sense, fitted an administrative frame. How would we administer? So, you know, so it is like saying if there is sea level rise, tomorrow you declare that everything is in the coastal zone and you dispatch people in, you remove people, but you don't account for the fact that sea levels are rising, no? If sea levels are rising, then people who are not in the coastal regulation zone will fall inside the coastal regulation zone eventually. So what do? Send them away. Administratively, legally, it may be sound the simpler solution, but that's not the solution to the real problem. So I think the Gadgil report was destined to fail. And this is unfortunate. I have a paper on this in the Economic and Political Weekly with some colleagues. Somebody managed to persuade the EPW to put a note on it saying there are inaccuracies, which I reject. Please take a look at our paper. I stand by that paper. And the point that we have made with very simple data, very elementary point, is that there are, first of all, there are large numbers of people whose livelihoods are threatened. These people may be in harm's way. We have to investigate that. I'm not saying no. But you cannot say simply, okay, we are going to redraw the boundaries. This is what it is going to be. Now we are going to figure out how people will manage. I think first you have to figure out how people will manage and then draw the boundaries. I think that's not what happened. Unfortunately, it was destined to end up where it is. And so we have a very polarized and unfortunate debate in Kerala, which is pro-Gadgil or not pro-Gadgil. I don't think that is the debate we should be having.
Yes, sir. Some more questions. It was a wonderful presentation, sir. My question is, how can the Global South ensure better living standards for its people without challenging environmental sustainability while contributing to the ongoing global energy transition? I'm asking this in the context of inherent inequality between Global South and North in the current scenario, which might replicate itself in future. I think somebody, Shraddha, is following it up with how feasible it is to disentangle global and local factors. This might help the mitigation process. Yes.
That Shraddha unfortunately doesn't. Global and local factors in adaptation and mitigation are two very different things. So I think it is, I will leave it at that. See, I think, for instance, it's a difficult effort uh, to find a pathway for the global south with better living standards for its people without challenging environmental stability while contributing to the global transition. But you see, you have to remember the global south, the transition it faces is not only energy, all our development. In fact, the word transition itself seems a little misplaced. We have the rural-urban transition. We have the demographic transition. We have the whole process that we call modernization, modernity. There are many transitions at work, and these are all equally important. And you cannot, therefore, like the global north, have a discourse which says, what are you doing about energy? Yes, energy access, etc., important. But for us, energy access is important for climate, but energy access is also important for many other things, for livelihood, for employment, for better lives. So I think it is a tough haul. I think as students and as I see from the participants, a lot of people who are one way or the other connected with academics, our primary task is to find new ways of thinking about this problem. And that is the first challenge. The South has to find its way out of where it is today. It first of all needs to think differently. And I say this with the utmost seriousness. In fact, if you will permit me to go back to the PowerPoint, this is exactly what I was trying to say over here. the global discourse is completely dominated by the global north, now you have this, the moment a paper appears in nature, and nature, is very picky, choosy about who it publishes. The moment it appears, it is they put out a press release depending on the prestige of the institution. Then immediately various news outlets pick it up, and eventually it will make the New York Times, and it will become policy. So I think we are living in this constant wave of northern discourse, and we simply do not have the time sometimes to think for ourselves, and for the rest of the time we do not have the kind of knowledge material, knowledge products that would enable us to think differently. Unfortunately, there are a section, our academia is very tied to the global north in its habits for good reasons in many cases. But on the question of climate, this has not been very helpful. And we had a very interesting visitor in MSSRF and in other institutions visiting us, a leading IPCC former vice chair from Africa, and he was saying the same story. We need to have our own paradigm. So how is it that we must conceive of a different world, not a doomsday world, but a world that thinks of a sustainable future where well-being and environmental sustainability go together? What are the trade-offs? It won't be simply win-win. I don't think that is possible. What are the trade-offs? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? I think we need to do our own thinking. And if that, I believe, is the first step. We have positive results. I think at the IPCC, there is a new drive to thinking about equity in the outcomes of the findings of the IPCC. What is the role of equity in climate action? And I think so sustained effort can produce results, but we have to put in that effort. I'll stop here.
Okay, sir. Any questions? No. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Professor Jayaraman. Thank you for coming to this talk, and I thank you, Abhinav, for and the team for organizing this third talk of the. Is there anything next planned which you want to announce? There will be some more talks that will be planned, and you will inform us. Can I close the session, or you want to talk? Yeah. Okay, Professor Jayaraman, thank you. Hope to meet you here sometime. And yeah.
Yes, I look forward to visiting again and meeting people in person.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. To online participants, thank you for participating. I'll be closing the meeting now. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah.